Welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to be discussing Covering Ukraine, which is a book compilation of a series of YouTube interviews between a YouTube personality known as Anya K and Scott Ritter, former weapons inspector, former U.S. Marine, former lots of things. And it's a fascinating book, not only because it's somewhat caught in the middle of the war. The war's not over yet, and it still manages to provide a very good snapshot of how we got here and how the war has been going, or as it is called in Russia, the special military operation. So we'll start with how it started. And what else is neat about this text is there's basically excerpts of each article, and then there's a QR code which will then get you the full video, so you'll have more context for whatever excerpt you're reading. And so a lot of the times I'm going to be reading Scott Ritter's words. If I'm not reading his words, I'll make sure that I'll say it's Anya. A lot of people say that when you start a war based upon an illegal act, that's an illegal war of aggression, and everything that follows is by necessity illegal. So it's important that we start at the beginning. Russia started this war based upon legitimate, legally sound, collective self-defense requirements that were brought about by 8 years of NATO-assisted Western Ukrainian aggression against the people of the Donbass, together with clearly articulated intent on the part of NATO to use Ukraine as a military proxy to bring further harm to the people in Donbass and the people of Crimea, and that rather than allowing this threat to manifest itself in action, Russia preempted it and moved in militarily. If you look at Russia's goals and objectives early on, we now know that Russia wasn't trying to occupy Ukraine or destroy Ukraine. Russia was trying to compel Ukraine into a negotiated settlement. Russia invaded on February 24th, 2022, and by March the 2nd, they were already entering into negotiations. 3 negotiations in the first week of March, and finally a concluding negotiation in Istanbul on April the 1st that was supposed to bring this war to an end. And we now know that Boris Johnson is the one who tanked that and made sure that the Ukrainian people stayed in this war and continued to lose a lot of its young men, and some of its older men too. Russia's actions conform with the case they made for intervention, namely the elimination of the immediacy of the threat to seek a peaceful resolution to the problem. Everything Russia has done has conformed with the letter and intent of the law. Ukraine, on the other hand, was allowing itself to be used as a proxy by NATO to wage a genocidal war against the ethnic Russians. I call it genocidal because, in April of 2014, Ukraine declared the ethnic Russian people of the Donbass and Crimea as terrorists, and they began an anti-terrorist operation that manifested itself in extreme violence, including stuffing 150 people into a trade union building in Odessa, setting it on fire, and cheering as 48 of them died, the rape and pillaging of Mariupol in June of 2014, and the violence that ensued since then. The crimes being committed by Ukraine are being backed by NATO and the collective West, who are empowering them with training and with political support, especially a coup d'etat in February 2014 that was in violation of sovereign Ukrainian law and in violation of the concept of self-determination. And for those of you who are new to some of these ideas, keep in mind that America has been interfering in everyone's politics for many years. I would say the earliest you could say would be 1820, Declaration of the Monroe Doctrine, in which we declare the right to basically interfere in our hemisphere, and then later on, as the isolation wore off, or the desire for isolation wore off, we took on the quote-unquote responsibility of messing with everybody's business. All right, so here, this conversation happened in April of 2022. Scott, we're entering the 3rd month of a war that nobody believed would last more than a month. No one did. Many thought, myself included, that is actually going to be won a lot quicker. I was surprised about 3 things, actually. One was the soft approach taken by the Russians going in. I understand why they did it. I think history will show us it was a fundamental mistake because it was made on flawed assumptions. You know that Russians arrested 150 officers from the FSB that belonged to the 5th Department that's responsible for doing the intelligence preparations of the battlefield in Ukraine. This group apparently told the Russian leadership that we control certain Ukrainian generals who are going to keep their troops in the barracks, and we have bought mayors who are going to ensure that we have the support of the public. This is why the Russians did what they call the bucket of water. They flow down the hill, take the path of the least resistance. So they put those poor boys on convoy and said, drive until somebody stops you. Just keep on driving. And they did. The Ukrainians didn't stay in their barracks, and the mayors weren't going to support them, and these initial convoys got extended and ambushed and slaughtered. It was horrible. That was a huge mistake by the Russians. So that's one. Two, I don't think anybody expected, and we should have, this is a fundamental failure of analysis on my part and on everybody's part, that the Ukrainian military turned out to be a lot more professional and a lot more capable and a lot more willing to sacrifice than people thought. I think some people thought, myself included, that once you take out a few elite units that the Ukrainian military will fall like a house of cards, and that they would surrender because the Russians are going to come in with their doctrine. The other thing is that the Russian doctrine, and again, history teaches, it's amazing how once reality hits you, you suddenly remember the lessons of history. The Russians were fighting World War II, because there was never a major land combat in the Cold War. It was really an adaptation of World War II tactics through the Cold War, and then it continued. The Russian doctrine, the exercises they ran in the fall, moving major tanks, etc. I think the Russians were educated that doctrine has to be modified because a capable enemy with good weapons and good training and good leadership will slaughter you if you come at them like that. So the Russians haven't changed their way, and that's why there was such a big pause between the withdrawal from Kiev and moving in, because the Russians had to retrain their guys. And so now Scott is going to take us on an extended excursus to educate a lot of us on what does it mean when Putin is referring to the Nazis in Ukraine. And again, we're not going to have a discussion about the Nazis today. That's a different conversation. But what we can talk about is the Ukrainian forces in what was known as the Soviet Union were working with Nazi handlers. So again, this is Scott. Many will say this conflict began when Vladimir Putin ordered the Russian military into Ukraine in February 2022. Others will say it began when Vladimir Putin ordered the Little Green Men into Crimea in March and April 2014. Some will say it began in February 2014 when the United States precipitated a coup in Kiev, the Maidan, or what some people call the Revolution of Dignity. But I don't think it'll be called the Revolution of Dignity because the victors write history. And that term, while it should be put in there, I mean, again, I'm somebody who believes that history should be told from all perspectives. And you know that that term should be put in there, so people understand how one party sought to manipulate and twist words to justify their actions. It wasn't a revolution of dignity because no people who are dignified would allow an outside power to come in and manipulate them the way they did, or allow a political minority to use violence to seize control of the political processes, which again happened with the right sector, Svoboda, and the other Banderists supporting the Ukrainian political elements. So a Banderist is referring to Stepan Bandera, more about him in a moment. Other people would say that it began in 2004, 2005 with the Color Revolution, again another American European Union-backed effort to install Ukrainian nationalism at the expense of ethnic Russian elements in the Ukrainian government. We can keep going backwards. You see, what is happening here is that this war didn't just happen in a vacuum. We keep going backwards to what happened in 1990, 1991 as the Soviet Union began to collapse. What was the American vision? How did we view Ukraine? How is the CIA, which we know was involved in 2014, which we know is involved today, what was the CIA's role in shaping Ukrainian nationalism? You know, we would suddenly have to realize that the CIA, which stopped officially funding Banderist or nationalist organizations in 1990, when did they begin funding them? Back in 1948. Why 48? What was going on with the CIA, the OSS actually at the time, and these nationalists? We'd have to dig deeper and find out the roots of the American intelligence agency's involvement. We'd realize that they were collaborating with Nazi intelligence organizations that used Ukrainian nationalists as proxies. We'd have to delve into the relationship between the Banderist movement and Nazi Germany. We'd have to get into the roots of Banderism in Poland in the 1930s. And we can just keep on going backwards to see how people have been using Ukrainian nationalism for their own ends. Vladimir Putin spoke about this several times, famously with Tucker Carlson in his televised interview last February, where over 1 billion people watched and rolled their eyes in boredom as Putin talked about Ukrainian nationalism, being a creation of Austro-Hungarian politicians and generals during World War I, to help create unrest in the territories of Galicia that are disputed between the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Russian Empire. And we could just keep on going further and further and see how, this thing called Ukrainian nationalism, it's not real Ukrainian nationalism. It's a Galician nationalism. It has nothing to do with Slavs per se, and everything to do with sort of Greco-Catholic elements that were ethnically, religiously, and culturally distinct from what many people called Kievan Rus, the sort of the birthplace of modern-day Russia, and how these nationalists were used, manipulated, turned into this white supremacist group. And I say white supremacist, but everybody was white back then, so it was just supremacist. It was the notion of a superior race separate from everybody else, and how it was turned into a cult of violence. If you are a Pole, Wolin means something to you. You know what happened in Wolin. You know what happened when the Western Ukrainians rose up and slaughtered over 110,000 Poles. And this isn't just slaughter. I mean, we're talking about killing. There is an artist that has painted pictures that are derived from the first-hand testimony of what the Western Ukrainians did to the Poles. And I would say that those paintings are not meant for the lighthearted. But when you take a newborn infant who is alive and you physically break their hands, break their bones, break their body in front of the mother who you've just disemboweled, but she's left alive, but you've staked her out, and you hack to death people while they're alive so body parts are lying there. Meanwhile, to hide the sounds from other villagers, you have a female choir standing outside singing songs to disguise the screams of what's happening inside the building. And this isn't an isolated event. It happened over and over again. 110,000 murdered people. This is a sickness that has infected certain people. The fanaticism of these people has been used by others over history, and that's what we're going to see here, is how outside parties have used this psychotic fanaticism that is Western Ukrainian nationalism, not to further the quote-unquote legitimate Ukrainian aspirations of the Ukrainian people, because nobody has ever respected the legitimate national aspirations of the Western Ukrainian people. No one. There's never been an independent Ukraine. I mean, today we have this entity called Ukraine, but it's not really what the Western Ukrainian nationalists want, because a huge chunk of this Ukraine is Russian. Eastern Ukraine was just sort of artificially appended by Lenin and Stalin and Khrushchev to create something that could be economically viable as an entity that was never meant to be politically independent from centralized Soviet authority. That's what people need to understand. And when the Soviet Union started expanding Ukraine and creating this thing called Ukraine, it was never meant to be independent. It was always supposed to be part of a larger union of Soviet socialist republics and never intended to be an independent entity. And in fact, as the Soviet Union collapsed, all of these silly experiments have caused major problems and heartaches. I've talked with the people in the regions who've had to deal with it. I've talked with Armenians and Azeris about Nagorno-Karabakh, which was, again, a Soviet experiment of making sure that countries wouldn't seek independence because they had too much ethnic mixing. I've talked with Georgians and Russians about South Ossetia and Abkhazia. These were Soviet things that have left scar tissue in the current nation states in those areas. So back to Scott. And yet, when the collapse of the Soviet Union came, the United States sought to use the Ukrainian nationalism to undermine Russia, to help break up Russia, to help weaken Russia, to help ensure that Russia never again could rise from the ashes of the Soviet Union to threaten the West, because Russia is still a place with tremendous resources, mineral resources, and as such is self-sufficient. The West doesn't like self-sufficient nations because it's hard to bring them under your economic control when they can live without you. So we needed to break them up, and we used Ukrainian nationalism to achieve this. The Ukrainian nationalism isn't, again, a legitimate national aspiration. It is a nationalism defined by Stepan Bandera and the Banderist struggle against Soviet, Polish, and Belarusian rule after World War II. A lot of people don't understand the level of fighting that took place, the violence that took place, as these Ukrainian nationalists who used to be allies of Nazi Germany. In fact, their ranks were full of Nazis. It's interesting when you dig into history. There is a history that shows the existence of a group called the Gehlen Group, which was an intelligence organization during World War II that operated on the Eastern Front exclusively. They had elements within this organization, this group, the Eastern Forces, that would do operations inside the Soviet Union, inside the rear area. So they would be flown in or parachuted in, and then they would operate. In I think October or November of 1944, after the Russians had kicked the Germans out of a lot that is present day Ukraine, the Germans sent a team in, around 70 guys, and they landed, and their job was to go out and contact Banderists. And they did. They made contact and reestablished contact. They gave them orders about what they were supposed to do. But when you read the reports, those Germans are talking about how in the Banderist ranks there were about 700 German soldiers who had been left behind. You see, when you have millions of Germans running from the Soviets for their lives, many of them go to the ground, go to the woods, and they find common cause with the Banderists. So there were about 700 German soldiers who weren't able to make it out to Germany who stayed behind to fight with these Banderist organizations. So the Nazi link is a lot closer than people think. They continued to be directed by the Nazis up until the very end, and when the Gehlen organization was absorbed by the US Army forces in Europe, later by the OSS, and later by the CIA, they still maintained this connectivity. And then the CIA would take Ukrainians from the displaced people's camps in Germany, train them up, and parachute them into Ukraine. This is in the late 1940s, the 1950s, to link up with these remaining combat forces. I think the last of them were finally rooted out. I mean, there's some talk about up until 1960 killing individual guys in buildings, but the last organized resistance was in 1954, 1955, when they were all killed. But then the CIA, instead of saying, oops, it's done, the CIA continued to fund this Banderist group in diaspora and have that money and the organizing principles of Banderism put back into the Soviet Union. When Khrushchev came to power, he started this de-Stalinization thing. He gave a secret speech where he criticized Stalin, and he released people from the Gulag. He shut down the giant Gulag system and got rid of all the political prisoners. And most of the Banderists, over 20,000 who had been arrested, over 200,000 who had been arrested, were released and brought back to Ukraine. 200,000 is not a small number. And then they began the process of re-insinuating themselves into Ukrainian society and the Ukrainian government, all backed by the CIA. People don't understand that. The Banderists who came in are being backed by the CIA, backed by the Banderist organizations in diaspora. They made common cause, and they were in the process of insinuating them, to re-insinuate themselves back into Soviet society so much that in 1990, when the Soviet Union goes away, the CIA went, well, look, we've already won. We don't need to continue funding these people. Covertly we won. They are in power, so we are in power. Ukraine has always been a CIA exercise, a CIA-controlled experiment of destabilizing first Soviet authority and now Russian authority. So, some background and how it started. So, how has the conduct been going during the war? Russia has bent over backwards to avoid civilian loss of life. Tragically, thousands of Ukrainian civilians have lost their lives in this conflict. But if you take a look at it, historically speaking, especially when we're dealing with large-scale ground combat operations in a European environment where you have dense populations, towns, villages, etc., that get caught up in the conflict, the civilian casualties roughly correlate 1-to-1. So for every dead soldier, there is a dead civilian. Let's look at a historical example, the American and French and British liberation of Normandy, and the battles that were fought there in June and July 1944. 60,000 French civilians were killed, and yet we call it a just campaign. Justifiable campaign, the liberation of France from the German occupier. 60,000 correlates to the total number of dead among the Germans and the Allies in that region. And I've spoken with Normans before who say that this was well known among their families. It just wasn't discussed because the idea was the Americans were coming to try to liberate us. So there was a great deal of tragedy, not only loss of their livestock when all the bombs would come in and kill all the animals that were there, but a lot of people were killed as well. So that's never really talked about. It's important that Scott's noting it here because he's giving us background for how are civilians killed sometimes in war, and a recent historical example. The Russians are not only complying with international humanitarian law, they are going above and beyond because under humanitarian law, they didn't have to do what they've been doing. Once Ukrainians turn buildings into military objects, which are impeding Russia's military objectives, Russia has every right to apply the force necessary to eliminate that threat. And if civilians die in the process, that is collateral damage. Instead, the Russians are going out of their way to avoid collateral damage. The Russians are sacrificing the lives of their soldiers to save human lives. The Russians are capturing Ukrainian prisoners of war and treating them well. Not just your average Ukrainian, they're capturing Nazis, people with swastikas, with the tattoos, People whose cell phones show them committing horrific crimes against civilians, against Russian soldiers, and instead of executing them or torturing them, they, the Russians, bring them in and treat them in accordance with international law. They provide them with shelter, food, medical care, and give them access to the International Red Cross. In many cases, they exchange them for Russian prisoners of war. The Ukrainians, when they do capture Russians, we now know through video evidence that they execute a lot of Russians. They torture Russians. They do medical experimentation, castration on Russian prisoners. They beat them. And when they release them, the Russians are in a horrific mental state and physical state. And you have to realize, why is that happening? Because of the Banderists, not because of a rank and file Ukrainian soldier. It's these Azov battalion types who are pushing this narrative. And then to give Scott to give us some context for how Americans normally take on these situations in which civilians are in a building. To be frank, when Americans go to war, our number one priority is the preservation of American life. We weren't willing to go street to street in Mosul, even though there were tens of thousands of Iraqi civilians trapped in there to clean out ISIS. No, because Americans would die, and we couldn't have Americans dying, we pulled back and flattened the neighborhoods, killing all the civilians. But that was okay, because there were some ISIS people in there, and that's what we had to do. There's been no condemnation. You don't see anybody in the international community raising a red flag about the number of people we killed in Raqqa when we took that over, the Syrian city that ISIS took over as its capital, when we flattened that city. Even in the final days, when we dropped bombs on the final ISIS positions, you had ISIS soldiers hiding among a group of women and children, and we dropped a bomb on them anyway, killing them all because there were soldiers there. Nobody cried, nobody whined. The US military, that's what we do. Those are unfortunate collateral consequences. And I don't think Scott's tone here, I don't think he's trying to defend that. I think he's just explaining the difference between US doctrine and behavior and what the Russians have been doing. And he references a Amnesty International report, which we don't have time to get into a separate report within the review of this book, but I'm just going to read some highlights from the legal review panel briefing of the press release. So there's an Amnesty International report, and then there's a press release relating to that, and then a legal panel reviews the assertions, the claims, the conclusions of the Amnesty International report. So as I said, it's about 20 pages. You can find it online if you'd like. I know I'll put a link to it in the description, but I'll just read some of the quotes. The principal factual finding of the press release that in the various locations surveyed, Ukrainian armed forces placed themselves in civilian objects in the proximity of civilians who remained in these areas, including hospitals and abandoned schools, is reasonably substantiated by the evidence presented to the panel. The principal legal finding of the press release was that Ukrainian forces failed to take precautions to the maximum extent feasible to protect civilians in their areas of operation. This legal conclusion was based on related factual findings, primarily that alternative locations existed in which Ukrainian forces could have lodged soldiers that were equally militarily beneficial, but were not as proximate to civilians. On the basis of the evidence it collected, Amnesty International would have been justified in concluding that Ukrainian forces could or might have violated international humanitarian law, but the panel considers that the conclusion that they did violate international humanitarian law was too categorical. So the panel here is pulling back a little bit on some of Amnesty's claims, but is mitigating by saying could or might, not definitely didn't. The panel finds that Amnesty International, could reasonably substantiate its findings that Ukraine did not take specific efforts to evacuate civilians in the areas proximate to the buildings where Ukrainian forces were located. And the panel finds that Amnesty International researchers reasonably substantiated their finding that Ukrainian armed forces did not issue specific warnings to civilians in the areas proximate to the buildings where Ukrainian armed forces were located. Now, I want to point out, I'm not trying to claim that Amnesty International is correct in everything that they say. But what I wanted to look at is that the behavior towards Amnesty International is never a question of dealing with the claims. It's a question of attacking the messenger. This is what we've seen with the ICC and the ICJ, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch in relation to the Zionists and Israel. There's never any claim that, well, maybe that one sentence in your report could be right. No, they're always condemned. And the US, which is happy to talk about the legitimacy and the importance of the ICC and the ICJ when it comes to Putin and when it comes to Russia, says that it's a joke organization and should be prosecuted when they dare to question Israel. So you just have to look at the double standards and just see that it doesn't mean anything. The US government does whatever it wants, and it tries to cover itself with whatever excuses it may. But you have to respond to the claims. You can't just attack the messenger because you don't like what the message is. And that's something that you have to be serious about if you want to look into these affairs and realize, oh, okay, it's not the same thing. The Russia-Ukraine conflict is not at all analogous to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So people trying to say, oh, it's just the same thing and it's an invasion of land. No, go read your history and learn some more. And if you'd like to learn more, there's plenty of reading going on my Palestine bookshelf channel, which is linked in the description. I've got still plenty of learning to go. So when we're talking about what's been going on during the war, you realize there was quite a bit of resistance in the beginning, as Scott alludes to. But there are plenty of videos online which you can find in which effectively Ukrainian recruiters are having to kidnap men and put them in vans and take them from their families and bring them in. So the question is, what does it mean to you that Ukrainians are not willing to participate in this war? Is it really a fight for their life and freedom and rights? Or is there some truth to the fact that they don't really consider themselves, at least particularly in eastern Ukraine, so very, very different? And that the Western Ukrainian nationalists, which have passed themselves off as generally Ukrainian nationalists, are the ones running the narrative, but that most Ukrainians don't feel the way that they do. So to give you some numbers, for the United States, we had a recruitment goal last year of 60,000 for the Army, and we fell 6,000 short. The United States, so if someone says the United States needs to increase its conventional military forces, we're talking about increasing what, 150 to 200,000? But we can't even meet the 60,000. And we want to go to 150,000? Well, Russia just expanded by 600,000. Number one military in the world. That is the reality. So when you're just talking about numbers, you're talking about a military and a weapons industry that can scale up for a conflict while everyone else has been prepared for very low-level conflict, bombing campaigns mostly, bombing civilians in Pakistan with drones or bombing Serbians during the 90s. It's very easy to bomb people from the air. It's much harder to actually send in ground troops, and NATO is learning this. This has been a big learning experience for NATO as well. So how is this going to end? Anya is asking Scott. The day of negotiation is over. Russia is not going to negotiate. They tried that for over a decade, as some would say over 2 decades. In December of last year, they gave the United States, NATO, 2 drafts, treaties, completed documents that said this: What we need is to stop a military operation in Ukraine. We need a guarantee of Ukraine being neutral, and we need NATO to basically step off, stop expanding. But more than that, Russia said, it's intolerable to have nations on our peripheries, like Poland, like the Baltics, who receive NATO formations, NATO bases. We, Russia, have no problem with Poland having the military. Poland is a sovereign nation. Poland can do what it wants to do. Poland can even be a member of NATO. We have no problem with the Baltics having militaries or being members of NATO. We wish they weren't, but they can join the European community. They can have whatever economic relations they want. But what Russia is not going to agree with is that when a British battalion is on Lithuanian soil, what bothers Russia is when an American division is on Polish soil, because now Russia has to ask, what is the purpose of putting these forces so close to our soil, especially when NATO has proven to be an offensive organization that has, as part of its mission, regime change. So it's not, as it pretends to be, some sort of defense alliance. NATO just engages in offensive attacks recently. That's what it does. And remember, it's in search of a mission. It doesn't really have a mission because the Soviet Union collapsed. So did the Warsaw Pact. But NATO, the military industrial complex, wasn't willing to give up all of the sales and the customers that they created. So you have to create an enemy, and we have to say, well, Russia is still the enemy, and we're going to keep going with NATO. This Ukrainian war, I believe historians are going to put a pin on the map and say this is the war that signaled the end of the American empire. That from this point on, what we're going to see is collapse. We're going to see a decline. We're going to see retreat. The rise of BRICS as an economic and political counterweight to the US controlled G7 and G20 was accelerated by this conflict. This conflict compelled not only Russia and China to come together to breathe relevance into BRICS, because BRICS predated this by a decade. But up until then, nobody really took it seriously. It wasn't a serious organization. What could it do? The G7 was so much more influential. But now Russia and China came together and said, we must create a counter to the rules-based liberal order. You know, the international order that the United States is promoting and effectively pushes on everybody else. Now, Ritter also suggests here, well, he also talks about a nuclear deterrent. Well, before I get to that, let me talk about Anya's really interesting framing of NATO as a gang. So this is from a NATO communique of July 2023. We, the heads of state and government of the North Atlantic Alliance, bound by shared values of individual liberty, human rights, democracy, and the rules of law, have gathered in Vilnius as war continues on the European continent to reaffirm our enduring transatlantic bond, unity, cohesion, and solidarity at a critical time for our security and international peace and stability. NATO is a defensive alliance. It is the unique, essential, and indispensable transatlantic forum to consult, coordinate, and act on all matters related to our individual and collective security. We reaffirm our ironclad commitment to defend each other and every inch of Allied territory at all times, protect our 1 billion citizens, and safeguard our freedom and democracy in accordance with Article 5 of the Washington Treaty. We will continue to ensure our collective defense from all threats, no matter where they stem from, based on a 360-degree approach to fulfill NATO's 3 core tasks of deterrence and defense, crisis prevention and management, and cooperative security. And here I put in the margin, what a joke, at this next sentence. We adhere to international law, except when it comes to Kosovo, and to the purposes and principles of the Charter of the United Nations, except when it comes to Iraq, and are committed to upholding the rules-based international order, except when it comes to Israel. This summit marks a milestone in strengthening our alliance. So Anya says, I want to start with something important, and that's with NATO's Article 1. It says, the parties undertake as set forth in the Charter of the United Nations to settle any international dispute in which they may be involved by peaceful means, in such a manner that international peace and security and justice are not endangered, and to refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force in any manner inconsistent with the purposes of the United Nations. My question is this, if this is Article 1, what happens if this article isn't respected? They're not even respecting their own Article 1. So Scott responds, well, what happens when you are from a club and you make club rules and everybody decides after a while that these rules are inconvenient, we are just going to disregard them. You know, NATO, of course, is in violation of its own rules. I mean, this is what I call the morality clause of NATO, trying to establish NATO as a legitimate organization, you know, an organization of defense, meaning that the only time NATO would use military force would be if they were attacked and then Article 5 comes into play. And so they set out and say, we will seek to resolve everything peacefully. We're not an aggressor organization. That clearly isn't the case today. NATO is a violent organization. War is its business. It exists only for war. It exists to use the threat of military force and actual military violence in pursuit of its collective policies, and more realistically, as an extension of American foreign and national security policy. So Anya responds, so it's like a gang. Scott, I like that. Can I steal that? Because I'm going to use that. Anya, it's just my simple way of thinking about these things since I'm not an expert. So what else we have to keep in mind is when we think about the nuclear balance of power, this is not a question of these other nations possessing nuclear power. It's United States weapons staged in multiple countries. The United States has an imbalance in capability. We have 100 B-61 bombs on European soil allocated to NATO. Russia had no equivalent. So when you get into horse trading in the nuclear disarmament talks, there is no Russian equivalent for that. So Russia, when asking the United States to get rid of the B-61 bombs, the United States, of course, is saying, well, what's in it for us? What do we get out of it? And if Russia can't give something that's analogous to it, the United States is going to say, no, we're going to continue to hold on to this thing. So this was talking about the fact that Russia had moved some weapons into Belarus, nuclear weapons. Russia has the analogy. They say, we have our nuclear weapons in Belarus, and if you want to get rid of these, then you have to get rid of those. And we have a precedent for this in the Cuban Missile Crisis with the Jupiter missiles that NATO had in Turkey. And there was a horse trade that the Soviets agreed to remove the missiles from Cuba as long as the Jupiter missiles were removed from Turkey. And the Americans said, we will do it. They were outdated and were going to be replaced in 6 months anyway. But if you reveal this, then we will not honor this. And it was done, and we found out about it many years later. But the idea is you can have disarmament. We have had treaties in which nuclear capabilities were taken down. Let's say in insaner times, but we are not insaner times. We're with a bunch of crazy people. So the last thing I'm going to reference is the Nyet Means Nyet memo, and this is courtesy of WikiLeaks. So if you just you know what, I'll put a link to it again in the description. WikiLeaks, I mean, what a treasure. That's a different conversation for a different day. But this is a memo from January of 2018 from Ambassador William J. Burns, ambassador to Russia, in which he talks about, and this is what happens a lot, is that diplomats will engage with their counterparts. They'll think about things, then they'll write up a summary, and then the summary gets sent back in a confidential top secret report back to Washington, and then the president is briefed on these things. So WikiLeaks gives us insight, for better or for worse, into a lot of what was said. And this was said what I'm going to read you now is from 2018. This is after Crimea, but before this special military operation. And all of this is attributed to Ambassador Burns. Russia would view further eastward expansion as a potential military threat. NATO enlargement, particularly to Ukraine, remains an emotional and neuralgic issue for Russia, but strategic policy considerations also underlie strong opposition to NATO membership for Ukraine and Georgia. Lavrov, this is Foreign Minister Lavrov, long-time foreign minister. Lavrov stressed that maintaining Russia's sphere of influence in the neighborhood was anachronistic, meaning not relevant anymore, and acknowledged that the US and Europe had legitimate interests in the region. But, he argued, while countries were free to make their own decisions about their security and which political military structures to join, they needed to keep in mind the impact on their neighbors. Lavrov emphasized that Russia was convinced that enlargement was not based on security reasons, but was a legacy of the Cold War. He disputed arguments that NATO was an appropriate mechanism for helping to strengthen democratic governments. He said that Russia understood that NATO was in search of a new mission, but there was a growing tendency for new members to do and say whatever they wanted simply because they were under the NATO umbrella. Example, attempts of some new member countries to rewrite history and glorify fascists. Ukraine and Georgia's NATO aspirations not only touch a raw nerve in Russia, they engender serious concerns about the consequences for stability in the region. Not only does Russia perceive encirclement and efforts to undermine Russia's influence in the region, but it also fears unpredictable and uncontrolled consequences which would seriously affect Russian security interests. Experts tell us that Russia is particularly worried that the strong divisions in Ukraine over NATO membership, with much of the ethnic Russian community against membership, could lead to a major split, involving violence or, at worst, civil war. In that eventuality, Russia would have to decide whether to intervene, a decision Russia does not want to have to face. Dmitry Trenin, deputy director of the Carnegie Moscow Center, expressed concern that Ukraine was, in the long term, the most potentially destabilizing factor in U.S.-Russian relations, given the level of emotion and neuralgia triggered by its quest for NATO membership. Ukraine's gradual shift towards the West was one thing, its preemptive status as a de jure U.S. military ally another. Another issue driving Russian opposition to Ukrainian membership is the significant defense industry cooperation the two countries share, including a number of plants where Russian weapons are made. While efforts are underway to shut down or move most of these plants to Russia, and to move the Black Sea Fleet from Sevastopol to Novorossiysk earlier than the 2017 deadline, the GOR has made clear that Ukraine's joining NATO would require Russia to make major costly changes to its defense industrial cooperation. They have companies in there making products which they're going to have to remove because Ukraine would enter a different military situation. There would also be a significant impact on Russian-Ukrainian economic and labor relations, including the effect on thousands of Ukrainians living and working in Russia and vice versa, due to the necessity of imposing a new visa regime. And as someone who's had to apply for working visas in different countries, I can tell you it's not easy. Alexander Konovalov, director of the Institute for Strategic Assessment, argued, would become a boiling cauldron of anger and resentment among the local population. The GOR has also made it clear that it would have to seriously review its entire relationship with Ukraine and Georgia in the event of NATO inviting them to join. This could include major impacts on energy, economic, and political military engagement, with possible repercussions throughout the region and into Central and Western Europe. Russia would also likely revisit its own relationship with the alliance and activities in the NATO-Russia Council, and consider further actions in the arms control arena, including the possibility of complete withdrawal from the CFE and INF treaties, and more direct threats against U.S. missile defense plans. And yes, that happened. We didn't want to renew, and so Russia wasn't going to continue to abide by the treaty that needed to be renewed, and we're at more nuclear threat as a result. Georgia's opposition to NATO membership for Ukraine and Georgia is both emotional and based on perceived strategic concerns about the impact on Russia's interests in the region. It is also politically unpopular to paint the US and NATO as Russia's adversaries and to use NATO's outreach to Ukraine and Georgia as a means of generating support from Russian nationalists. While Russian opposition to the first round of NATO enlargement in the mid-1990s was strong, Russia now feels itself able to respond more forcefully to what it perceives as actions contrary to its national interests. So, with that all being said and read, I hope that this review of covering Ukraine has been helpful, and if you appreciate it, enjoyed it, please hit like, hit subscribe, please share it with people who you think might have only accepted the Western narrative of this as they have accepted the Zionist narrative of what has been going on in Israel and Palestine. And yes, there are always two sides. You have to examine both sides. And in the Western media, we've definitely heard Ukraine's, quote-unquote, Ukraine side, but as we know, it's really just Banderist, Western Ukrainian extremists' side. That's what's been represented in the media. And you certainly haven't heard Russia's side, although Putin, for those who paid attention, I was spellbound by that interview that he gave. Maybe we'll talk about that some other time. That the Russian side has been, let's say, somewhat briefly represented in that interview, but otherwise they're just seen as the big, bad, horrible bear, instead of what they have been is continuing encirclement by NATO, being made the bad guys, when the reality is Russia is not seeking to take over Europe. That is delusional, and in fact, in the last century, we've only had a French invasion of Russia, followed by a German invasion of Russia. So obviously, yes, there was the Soviet move back, but ostensibly they were allies of the West, so that wasn't an invasion, that was a fight back. Anyway, World War II, that's a different conversation. But I want to point out this idea that Russia's out to invade a bunch of people. It's crazy. And the record shows that it's the other way around. It's usually Europe that has been invading Russia. And they have failed. And they seem to have not learned their lessons, not read their history. But that's no surprise. Politicians are just in it for money. They're not in it for seeking virtue and taking care of their populations. If you'd like to support this work, consider sending a super thanks. There's a little heart button there. You can also, there's links for PayPal or buy me a coffee. You can send a one-time gift that way. If you really like this work and you want to see more, there's Patreon or YouTube membership. You can join, and for $5 a month, you can get early releases of videos like this one, chat with me behind the scenes, ask questions, and as time goes on, I'll be doing special member-only videos for the community as it grows a bit larger and we have some critical mass there. A reminder that in 2024, proceeds from these different channels are going, a portion of the proceeds are going to the Palestine Children's Relief Fund. I have a link to it in the description. Please go there, see their work. They're helping Palestinian children get medical care who would not otherwise get it. You can help them indirectly by supporting this channel. You can help them directly by going to the website and contributing yourself. And also, finally, there's an Amazon wish list there. Click through, see if there's any books that intrigue you, and if you buy it and send it to me, there's a good chance that I can review it in 2025. Can't promise, but let's say it's a pretty good chance. Until next time, enjoy your reading.